So I'd like to thank Egon Zender for their sponsoring of this program, and you'll get a chance to meet Todd as the program proceeds. I also want to thank Haley Hucken and Daniela Gonzalez, our staff who helped put this together. Without them, I would not be able to do all that we do for our chapter. And I'd like to ask for all of you to turn on your videos if you can. We were just talking about this. It makes the program more meaningful if we have a chance to see one another and really be able to exchange ideas if possible. I know that it's not possible for everyone. Now, one of the things that I'd like to also highlight is that Timothy Cho really came up with this program idea. This has been a long time in coming, but he mentioned it to me some time back, and I'm just so pleased that we have an esteemed panel to be able to bring it to life. And so with that, I'd like to pass it over to Timothy. Thanks so much.
Oh, whoa, Lisa. Okay, cool. So I think we were going to do introductions around the table. And maybe we'll start with Connor, and I'll end because then I can kind of kick everything off. How about that? So Connor,
there we
go.
Hey, Todd Hutchins here with Egon Zender. I've been, oh, sorry, were you saying Connor first? We can go Connor.
Go for it, Todd.
No
You're in flow. Go for it.
Yeah.
See, I haven't had my coffee yet, so a little on edge. Todd Hutchins with Egon Zender. I've been doing this for about 15 years. I sit in our San Francisco office and do a lot of board work. Probably about 50% of my time is spent on board succession, board search, and I do that across industries, but with a focus on healthcare and technology.
So I guess I'm next, Connor Kehoe, calling you today from Southern Italy, which is a better place to be in lockdown than London, England. So I hope you're all envious. I got into this, I'm a software engineer by background, but got into boards when I set up McKinsey's private equity practice 20 years ago, and was intrigued to see the differences between private equity governance and public market governance. And I now, having retired from McKinsey 2 years ago, lead a thing called the Board Intelligence Forum, which runs meetings like this for European and British, UK-based non-executive directors. Interestingly enough, we do it in the morning too, and we tend to find some Asian directors joining us because it's later in their day. So it'd be interesting to see who you end up with on the call over time if you start doing it in the morning. I recently led a piece for the Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science, on the impediments to the adoption of AI in international companies. London obviously has domestic companies, but there's quite a few truly international companies headquartered there, and we focused on that. So I hope to share some of that today. Back to you, Tim.
Hi, Lori Yoler. So I guess that's why we're up early in the morning, is to accommodate your Italy schedule.
Yes. Thank you for that. It's just before drinks time here, so you know I've had plenty of coffee, but no drinks.
Hi, Lori Yoler. I am also a software engineer by training, actually, and focused on AI in the 80s. Worked as an executive in a variety of technology companies. Started serving on boards in the 90s of both technology and non-technology companies, and currently am a general partner at deep tech venture capital firm Playground Global, as well as serving on a wide variety of public and private and nonprofit boards. And I'm very excited to talk about this topic, having been in many cases the sole technologist on boards in the past, and fascinated by this topic.
Thanks, Lori. So I'm Tim Cho, and so I actually came to Silicon Valley a long time ago to work for one of the original Kleiner Perkins startups, Tandem Computers, and never left. So I've had a career on the commercial side, and I've actually taught at Stanford University for a little bit over 30 years. Just as an interesting point, when I first started teaching, you could not get a bachelor's degree in computer science at Stanford, which is like totally amazing to think about. Anyway, I started my board work about 20 years ago. I've sat on several, and today 2 public company boards. And I've been, and this is a good segue into why we're here today. So I have been interested for quite some time in this question about board governance, and in particular with respect to technology, because as you all know, in every public company board, you have compensation committees, you have audit committees, and you have nominating governance committees. So the board sees itself as providing governance in those areas, but obviously in technology, let's say it's very spotty as to how boards think about this. The world is littered with companies that miss technology trends. You could think about Nokia and Apple, Blockbuster and Netflix, Barnes and Noble and Amazon. You don't have to go very far, and you could go into enterprise tech, which is where I've spent all my time, and even find more examples. So it's been a thing that's been sitting in my head for a while, kind of wondering about what is the role of a board in terms of governance. And so I had the privilege of spending time with the McKinsey team with respect to work I'm doing in the Internet of Things. I got to meet Connor several years ago in another terrible place, Sundance in Utah. Connor knows how to live. Let's just say that. So, and he and I stirred up a conversation with respect to this and the work that he's been doing. So I thought I'd start out with a couple of questions. Lisa and I talked a lot about this venue, and I said, well, part of this is I don't think any of us know the answer, and many of you guys may have already spent time thinking about this. So we wanted to spend some amount of time having Connor, Lori, and Todd talking about how they see it, but also we wanted to open it up to questions. And not to intimidate you, but I always start out my Stanford class with a mark of a great student is not what they know, but the questions they ask. So learn to ask great questions. So anyway, so I'm going to kick it off and say, here's kind of the thing I'm interested in, and I'll let Connor start off with, which is, okay, should boards be involved in technology governance? Question. If they should, then what is the vehicle? What is the mechanism? What is the structure? How do you think that happens? So I'm going to pass the ball over to Connor, and he's done a lot of cool work in the area. So let me pass it over to you, Connor.
Okay, Tim, well, look, the first thing I'd say is what kind of board are you? And I'm going to make life simple by dividing boards into two. Tim told me he was on a board once where an old hand on the board told him, Tim, your job is once every quarter to decide whether we stick with this CEO or we get a new one. So I'd call that a sort of low engagement board. And when I surveyed boards throughout the world, and you do find they sort of split into two camps. And we ask people how much time they spend, all in, thinking, reading, at board meetings. And to make life simple, there's the 20 days a year board, and there's the 40 days a year board. You tend to find quite a distribution in all regions, but if I would take the averages, the Asians are the most engaged in terms of the amount of time they spend. The Europeans are in the middle, and the US boards spend the least amount of time. But there's a huge distribution within that. So for those of you who've looked at, for instance, the research on the Netflix board, you'll see that the board members there attend executive committee meetings and meetings of management one layer below that, and meetings of management one layer below that as observers. So you can imagine their time commitment is considerable. So I think if you decide you're a low engagement board, and you'd never call yourself that, but you're in the job of deciding whether or not you've got the appropriate CEO, you're in the job of ensuring the board complies with all its reporting requirements, and you overview strategy, but you don't get much engaged in doing it. When we talk to the 40-day-a-year boards, they're actually doing, all the above, but they're deeply engaged in the strategy setting process, and they're probably also engaged in monitoring culture and assuring it's aligned with purpose, and getting into the bowels of the organization a bit to see how it operates. I think the challenge really lies with the high engagement boards. Low engagement boards aren't going to do much of this, but the challenge lies with the higher engagement boards. And when we talk to them, forget technology for a moment, just about contributing to strategy, which is essentially what Tim has alluded to. You know, if you get overtaken by trends, it's because you've not kept up, your strategy process hasn't kept up with the trend. But when you talk to high engagement boards about contributing with strategy, you'll often find that board members tell you that if they're not from the industry, it takes them about 2 to 3 years to feel competent in contributing to strategy, never mind technology, just strategy. And the reason for that, they tell us, is because even though companies do a great job onboarding them to the company, they actually do a dreadful job at onboarding them in the industry and its dynamics. So they just don't understand the industry dynamics unless they've been in that industry. And I think the same applies for high engagement boards with technology. There is a learning process. If you're going to contribute to strategy and setting direction, and technology is an important part of that, and where isn't it? There's a deliberate learning process that needs to be gone through. I have found that it's easier for tech-oriented companies to educate their board members. And the reason for that is they tend to see the technology more frequently and they get used to it. They start to understand, even if they've got humanities or legal background, they have to start to understand what AI means because they see the engineers using it first in the product. And then they start to think about it strategically. So it's a bit easier for them. But I think deliberate education is required. And even though it's tempting, I'm not convinced that a technology committee is the best way forward, because I suspect setting company direction is an activity all directors should be involved with. They might want a committee to inform them and educate them, but ultimately I think they do need to know enough to be able to have a viewpoint if they're that type of engaged board. And I might, Tim, just for the hell of it, talk about what goes wrong if you know, directors aren't up to the well educated enough, because we just did this work on AI and it's the barriers to its adoption. And I'll be very brief. The chief digital officers basically told us with these large UK-based companies, which are global companies, what goes wrong is if the board or senior management don't understand AI, they first of all find it hard to invest in an option to get going, because there isn't a business case to assemble your data and have it organized in a rational manner. There isn't a particular business case. They find that hard. Secondly, it's a huge cultural change, and they just don't know that they will need to intervene to help that cultural change happen. So what happens is you hire a pile of data scientists, and then they'll leave because they...
Connor, we're losing your audio a little bit. Do you want to take your video off so that
the organization got the data scientists? So my video's off. Can you hear me now?
Does
Okay.
everyone hear Connor better now?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. So my final point, I think, was the last one was, in people who are using AI in an advanced manner, boards fail to recognize that there are some important ethical decisions that need to be made and company reputation decisions. And what we found is if the boards don't recognize that, the people further down the organization just go completely conservative and self-censor a lot of topics. So you can see there are consequences to boards not being educated. So I would extol the notion of putting the effort in to get boards educated, maybe having an advisory committee on technology, but not letting board members off the hook by sticking essentially what is strategy into a committee. I'll stop there, Tim. It's probably too much, but I'll stop there.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up to that, and then I'm going to pass to another panel member. Connor, what do you feel like is a good mechanism? You made the point of education. What have you seen that works, doesn't work? How does that happen?
Well, two pieces of information there. I mean, one is what people have told me has worked well for them, board members, is to go and spend time with the, you know, if it's a non-tech company, with the chief data or chief digital officer, and spend time with him or her and just hang out with them. I know it sounds very simplistic, but they find that's an easier way to absorb information than more schoolroom or, you know, imparting of information. That's one. And linked to that is people spending time in the engineering functions if it's a sort of software-oriented company. So once again, they begin to absorb a bit by osmosis what's going on. And then finally, I do find that for understanding industry dynamics, because a lot of the time, tech isn't about purely tech, it's about tech in its competitive context. What's the rival doing? How far ahead is she? What actions are they taking? It's having somebody who can explain to you what's going on in the industry and how people with different technologies might be advantaged or disadvantaged. That usually takes an outside perspective, because insiders, like us all, are terrible about describing our own industries. You know, we describe how all of the competition are just price cutters that are out there destroying the market. We can't help ourselves. So finding somebody outside who really has a dispassionate view on the industry and its dynamics can be particularly useful.
Very cool. Lori, I'm gonna pass the ball to you. So the question is, you know, should boards be involved in technology governance? If so, how should this happen? What's your view on this?
I'm going to go into that, but first, since we have so many great participants, I thought I would put up, we had a couple polling questions to get to know the audience a little bit better. So
Cool.
Haley and Lisa, can we put up the polling questions? I'm not sure who's got the control of that.
I thought, Lori, if you want, I can read them off and we can just see a show of hands, if that's okay with you.
That sounds great.
Okay, great. The first question is, do you have a tech committee? So if you have a tech committee, raise your hand on your board, on any of your boards.
3, is that 3? Wow, okay. 3 out of, hang on, let me go to the other screen. Yeah, that's not a lot. Okay, I think there's 3 out of 71, okay.
4, I see.
Maybe
5.
4. 5.
Okay.
Okay.
And how many technologists do you have on your board? So show of fingers. I see 2, 1, 1, 0.
What's the definition of a technologist?
Yeah, good question. Okay, that's an excellent question. Okay, so I'll make a few comments and then I'm really looking forward to more of a discussion, since I recognize many amazing technologists in the audience, and I saw we just from the attendee list, a lot of folks who have had experience and either serve on technology company boards or have deep experience in technology. So the first thing I would say is I think it varies dramatically by industry. I think if you are a technology company and your business is selling technology, be it software or hardware or networking or security, you probably already have a bunch of technologists on your board if your nom-gov committee was inclined to say we need people who understand the industry. So I think technology companies have an advantage because there wasn't a search for technologists on the board, but there was a search for people who perhaps were retired CEOs or other executives. In financial services, one could argue that the key assets are digital. And so I think in financial services, you tend to have more people who at least understand technology, whether or not they were a technologist. Other industries, I think the whole concept of digital transformation is kind of a loaded term and seems intimidating. And so I think we all talk about this digital transformation, but how are we supposed to start? And the other question I would say for many boards is this is a new vocabulary. So often, you know, we technologists banter around these technology terms, and if someone hasn't grown up in the technology industry, it all seems kind of overwhelming. And I also think there's a generational difference where, you know, a lot of folks didn't grow up with that, and the IT staff was literally in the basement with no windows and was not considered an important strategic function, which brings me to key enterprise risks. So, and I think what Connor was talking about is how important is this to the overall strategy of the company? In financial services, really important. In a technology company, really important to stay ahead. In other industries, you know, there's some laggard industries and there's some leading industries in technology. There always have been. So how important is it right now? And that's going to involve what are competitors doing? What's the landscape doing? It's easy for us to say technology is equally critical to every company, but it's not. You know, there are some companies who have thrived without a lot of technology disruption, and they've maintained their financials in SAP or Oracle, and that's fine. And you know, they're a much more direct oriented, perhaps manufacturing, selling business. So is this viewed as a key enterprise risk? And if it's not, then how often is it discussed at the board level anyway? And so, and then the question is, how strong is this CIO who's in charge of maintaining SAP? Is there really going to be a meaty enough, if this committee is formed, who are they going to talk to? Are they going to talk to the dude who's maintaining SAP? If they have outsourced their cybersecurity, and I want to talk about cybersecurity, is this committee going to go meet with the outsourced agencies that or groups that are now managing the IT systems? Are they going to go meet with the outsourced, perhaps, security provider? What's their interaction going to be if this committee is formed? And I want to turn to cyber for a moment. There was a lot of questions a few years ago. Should we have a separate cyber committee? And should we bring a cyber expert onto our board for the same kinds of reasons? Now it's, should we bring an AI expert onto our board? And I think you have to be careful about having a narrow expert on your board to fit every role, because are they really, if cyber is only brought up once a quarter, twice a year, what is that board member going to be doing the rest of the time? Do they have the interest to dive into the financial and the legal stuff? Do they have the, can they help on many of the other discussions? You know, a company does M&A, do we need an investment banker on the board? Company gets into a lot of legal stuff, do we need a lawyer on the board? You know, you kind of say, if we add an expert in every specific narrow topic onto the board, it's going to be a very different kind of board. And it's certainly a discussion to have in the NomGov committee, but I think we have to be careful of a narrow expert when there are outside experts that we bring in often for those other committees. Does this warrant it? And I think you can't do a one size fits all. You shouldn't have a tech committee. You should have a tech committee, because I think it really depends. In financial services, maybe you do need a tech committee because there's so many things going on where technology is critical. And again, I think cyber has been a great case, you know, to say, okay, how many board members actually understand information security and privacy, right? That one could argue that information security and privacy is important to every company in every industry. And in fact, there's regulation around it, of course, of what we do with our customers' data. So that's kind of the first step into this field, I think, where we've had to dive in deeper in terms of what kind of technology have we put in place to meet those information security requirements or data privacy requirements. So I think, you know, how often is technology on the board agenda? And then back to the previous question, which technology are we talking about? Is it blockchain? Is it AI? Is it Internet of Things? Is it e-commerce? Is it digital currency? Is it robotics? Is it drone delivery of goods where you're talking to the FAA? Is it cybersecurity? You know, when we banter around, should we have a technology committee? Well, on what technology? And which one is important this year and which one's important next year? So those are some kind of broad ideas to get the discussion going. But I think looking at this as a one size fits all, you know, your audit committee is a little more standard. A technology committee could be all over the map depending on a lot of those factors.
Lori, just because I know you'd made some comments about this and Connor talked about education. What's your point of view on this? How do you educate a board? What does that mean? How does this happen?
So I think different people learn in different ways. And I find this in my work life. Some people love to read. Some people love to attend webinars. But I think for me, I think the most valuable thing is giving examples of either competitors or specific use cases that apply to that industry resonate the most. Because if you come in and say, blockchain, really critical, Bitcoin, really critical, but the company is doing hard goods manufacturing and distributes through other businesses and doesn't have a direct to consumer interface, it may or may not resonate, but if you give a specific example and a variety of specific examples that are specific to that industry, I think board members will perk up and say, wow, I didn't realize that our key partner was doing that, applying AI in that way, or applying whatever the technology is. And so I think it's very important to put it within industry context. And as we do with other things, to do some benchmarking against the competitors in our industry. Hey, have you looked that our number one competitor is doing X, Y, and Z, and we haven't even started thinking about it, you know, and having a robust board discussion about the competitive landscape is a good way to enter into that.
Todd,
Yeah.
circling back over to you. You know, with your experience, background, et cetera, I think you've clearly been in the role of trying to help boards hire the right, quote, the right people. There has always been this discussion about, oh, well, should we hire a technologist? So I'm going to ask the question to you, you know, should technology governance be a board level issue? If so, how? Is it by, quote, hiring the right board members?
Yeah. I'm going to tie together, I think, what you know, Tim, you, Connor, and Lori have mentioned. So first of all, and I'll get back to answering the question, because we do get a call all the time for, hey, we need a technologist to sit on our board because of digital disruption. And so those are, okay, so technologist is one term that needs to be defined. Digital disruption is another term that needs to be defined. And you really need to start by asking the questions there. So first of all, Connor, you talked about low engagement and high engagement boards. We certainly have seen a shift towards much more higher engagement. A lot of times, if you think back 20 years, board members picked the boards based on where the meetings were, and it was in Boca, it's great. You know, it was much more about sitting on a board than actually governing and helping lead a company. But there has been a move because of activist investors and just a general pace of innovation to see boards moving to more high engagement. The second, Lori, when you talk about technologists, I think you laid it out there. How important is technology to both the core operations of the business and potential disruption of the business? So I did a board search for a company that does daily staffing, and they did it all where people line up at their office and wait for the board to come out to get that daily staffing. Well, obviously, they were really at risk of disruption, and they didn't realize that everybody had a cell phone and everyone could be done through a text message. And so brought on someone with a background in both mobile and technology disruption from Accenture, but that was one that was really looking at disruption. Whereas if you look at a company like Microsoft, you know, bringing a board member on there, obviously technology is core to it, so it's, you know, a little bit different. The other thing is when you talk about digital disruption, people always then say, hey, we need someone from Google on our board. Okay, well, again, that's it's very different than someone from Facebook, someone from LinkedIn, but they, you know, they have these wonderful ideas. And then when you actually do a search, it typically starts with, we need someone who understands digital disruption, AI, and has been a sitting CEO. Okay, that's almost a null set when you're looking at that. And so really helping boards understand that if you are looking for board members, technologists or otherwise, that do have a background and experience in digital disruption, however that's defined, they've likely not sat on boards before. They likely are in their late 40s and early 50s at best. And so there's also not only a need to bring them up to speed on the industry and the dynamics, but also bring them up to speed on what does it mean to be a board member. And that's, again, defining the technologists there. It is going to take them 2 to 3 years to really start adding value because of the need to both learn what a board does and what the role is as a board member, as well as the, you know, the overall trends in the industry. So I'll stop there, Tim. I don't know if I addressed. I was trying to pull a bunch of pieces together here.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Todd. I'm wondering, you know, I'm going to make a comment and then let's open it up for a little bit of conversation here. So, you know, I've been speculating on the question of, if you look at how boards are composed, and we have, and I'm going to use compensation committees to kind of focus on this. So we do have compensation committees. And you look at it and say, well, is everybody an expert on compensation? Well, no. I mean, we've all done compensation, but are we an expert on compensation? No. So we create compensation committees, and then we bring in compensation consultants who do, among other things, work on, well, what's your peer group, how's your peer group, et cetera. And I've been wondering if that concept should apply to the world of technology. Should we have technology committees? Maybe. If we had technology committees, maybe we have a missing component. To Lori's comments, I don't know that you can, or Todd just said it, okay, I need a board member who's an expert in AI, machine learning, cloud computing, and the IoT. Okay, well, how many people are like that? On the other hand, could we not, have, quote, technology compensation consultants, so to speak, who do have a wider variety, and that we're missing that structurally in our board composition. So I'm going to throw that out there. I really am interested, as Lori pointed out, this is, you all have a lot of experiences out there. Throw out questions or, your own point of view as to whether technology governance is important. If so, then how do boards get activated? What should they be doing? Who should they be hiring? Should they structure things differently? So I don't know how you do this, Lisa, mechanically, but
Well, we do
I'd like to
have a
open
question
it up.
from,
Or
we have a question from Mary Kay, if they're still on the line with us.
I think that they had to leave, so.
That's fine. We have a question from Nora. Nora, if you want to go ahead and unmute on the advisory board.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Love to hear from you, Nora.
Yes. Okay, super. Yeah, I was wondering, I was really keying off Lori's comment of if you put a special purpose board member on, it may not make sense. I was hearing about some boards actually having an advisory board at their disposal that doesn't come into the board meeting, but is kind of a roundtable kind of thing where they get advice. Have any of you had experience either being on a technology advisory board or interacting with a board in an advisor role on some period of over some period of time?
I actually have sat on a number of technology advisory boards, and I wanted to go back. It was pretty funny because I did get called for a board position where they said they wanted a computer scientist who knew AI, IoT, and cloud computing. So that was the spec. It was kind of funny. But technology advisory committees, they're nicer because if the company really needs to start getting informed, often the technology advisory committee is not advising the board, but advising the CEO and the management team, and is brought in by the CEO. And in a lot of companies that I've been in, for example, when we were going to go into a different industry, for example, we were going to go into healthcare, we created a medical advisory committee. When we were going to go into, when we really wanted to understand some new technology, we would create an advisory committee. And the nice thing about an advisory committee is they're not taking a risk. So a lot of public companies say that they only want their executives on one board of directors because they don't want the potential legal risks. And so advisory committees are a looser structure. You can shut them down whenever they're not useful. They can last for a quarter, a year, whatever time frame. And so there's so much more flexibility. And it goes back to if the company is not in the technology industry and there aren't a lot of people in the company who are technologists, it's going to be a long-term process to get them up to speed. And so the board can suggest that the company not get disrupted by technology, but the board shouldn't be driving the technology strategy. It's got to be embraced within the company. And so I think an advisory committee can work really well because they can be having more frequent interactions with the employees without that conflict of, oh, wow, this is my boss, this is the board of directors.
Can I ask Nora a question? Because Nora, I think you're on the board at AMD, right?
Yes.
And you have a technology committee, don't you?
We do. Yes, we do. We do.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that. I mean, is it, necessary? Could you get rid of it? I mean,
well, it's funny because Yeah, so go ahead.
Go on. Yeah.
It's funny because yearly we say to ourselves always, unlike the other statutory committees, we say on the technology one, do we need this and is it providing value? And for the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, we keep coming out with yes. We went through a turnaround, which was a very tricky one. I don't know who follows the history. And we set up the technology advisory board to double click on huge decisions that would last 10 years. And so it was a hairpin turn for the company. And so when you have a board meeting, there's only so much real estate in terms of time. And so you talked about how often do you do strategy, but you also have to do other things. So we couldn't spend the whole time on technology. So it started that way of let's just have another set of eyes on these very important decisions that last a long time in semis. Now it's evolved because if you followed us, we've come out of the hairpin term. We're certainly not gliding by any means, but we're much more stable and a lot less likely to go under as we were. You know what it's really evolved to? The technology people are on that committee. We can see a lower level of engineer in the company, and it really is all around the risk of our strategic asset of our technical people. So it's a hybrid between technology, what are the trends, we have outsiders come in, we have customers come in, so it educates us, but it's also a venue for our most strategic asset, which are the technical people. And so when the CEO is going to promote to fellow or things like that, we use it. And one last thing is some of those people that present to the board from AMD actually think it's a perk. So, you know, they're technologists, so they don't really realize that it might not be the most exciting things in their lives, but for them it is. So I don't know if you have other questions. Hopefully I gave some context.
Nora, you're saying the perk is presenting to the board?
Yeah, you know, some of the senior engineers haven't, I was going to say something not mean, but like they haven't been outside in a long time. So they really get dressed up, they come in, and so they feel that someone cares and that there's a guiding hand. And some of us now are mentors to some of the technology people. So it's really been, and we also get a good feeling for what is the technology culture inside the company. So it's a way, someone had mentioned, once you hang around with the chief data officer or whatever, but we get to see the levels of engineering in the company and kind of probe it for the health.
So Timothy, you asked
Yeah.
about technical advisory board. So I served on the board of a venture capital fund, actually on the West Coast some years back, and we were investing in early stage life sciences. So we actually appointed an advisory board of medical experts. And we had 4 of those experts in that advisory board. And we found that to be their, I guess, opinions about our prospective investments to be very, very valuable.
Yeah, fascinating. Danielle, I know there's questions rolling through. You want to proctor them? Or, yeah.
We have a lot of questions coming through, which is great to see. So we have one from Simon on how do you apply all of this to an industry such as chemicals? So Simon, go ahead and unmute, and we'd love to hear from you on this if you could expand.
Yeah, I'm sure you probably don't want to get into industry-specific stuff here, but the chemical industry is pretty tech-oriented in things like process control, enterprise resource planning, and financials and all that. And I see many applications for AI there. But I just wonder how you guys think about finding other applications within an industry, like for customer service and, you know, market intelligence, all those kind of things. I was wondering if there are ways to really use technology in those kind of areas. And I don't know if anybody has any experience with that.
I will jump in if.
Well, Lori can. Sorry, I was just going to say Lori can speak to that.
Thank you.
Yes, Lori and I both sit on the same segment. One of the things I would recommend, and the companies that I sit on the board does do that. If you look at early stage investments, that is actually a good headlight to what is emerging the horizons that is enabled by new technology. So in one of my board, we actually established a quarterly update that are based on early stage investment within the scope that are relevant to our business, both in terms of the core, the peripheral, as well as the disruptive sectors. Sorry, Lori, go for it.
No, that's a great segue. So I do spend quite a bit of my time looking at early stage companies. And the interesting thing now is because future of work is so interesting right now, there are a lot of new companies that can work across the map, but there are a lot of new AI companies that are helping with employee engagement. And in particular on either a shop floor or a wet lab floor to help better communication, better automation. And so one of the things that I do for my boards is when I see an interesting early stage company that is using AI in a unique way, I will send it to the CEO and whichever executive in the company runs that space to say, hey, would this ever apply? Do you want to try it out? And a lot of them have been future of work oriented lately, which is interesting. What I did for one of my boards at the behest of the CEO of a public company board was put together a presentation on all of the big applications of AI broadly, not specific to their industry, to say, here's what's happening in other industries and other companies. Here's where AI is getting traction and actually having an ROI today. Here are the ones that are coming on the horizon to at least start the thinking happening. And so I think it's very useful to have someone either within the company or on the board that is allowed to start suggesting those things. And I bring that up because one of the boards I joined had recruited a technologist before me, and he'd been sitting on the board for 3 years. And when he was interviewing me to join the board, he said, I don't know why they're bringing on another technologist. I've been on it for 3 years and no one's ever asked me a technology question. So you need to make sure, again, there's a way to engage those board members when you recruit them, because if technology isn't discussed, and what are you going to do? So back to AI in the chemical industry, it'd be great if there's somebody on the board that maybe the CEO goes to and says, hey, can you, as the technologist on the board, kind of be tracking the stuff that's happening in our industry with regards to AI that our competitors are doing? And please feel free to shoot me emails when you see stuff, and maybe we'll have you give an update once a year to the board. I mean, think about that kind of thing. You're recruiting these people onto the board. If you're not engaging them in some way, you're not getting the value that you were recruiting for.
Can I offer you one that's, I think, sufficiently different, but along the same lines that you might find useful? I set up a thing a few years back, my sort of last gig at McKinsey, called McKinsey New Ventures. And essentially, to get it going, we set up a business plan competition. And so people within McKinsey were able to bring their ideas for essentially software and analytics-based entities, let's call them that. And we would fund them and set them up and allow the people to actually work on them for a year, funded with a team. Interestingly enough, by the way, and I found this also at universities, the people who come up with the ideas aren't necessarily the entrepreneurs who want to lead them. They might say, this is a great idea, Connor. I'd love to see it happen, but actually I quite like my day job. Find somebody else to do it for me. So I did actually have to spend a lot of time finding entrepreneurs to take good ideas. And in industries, in McKinsey, it wasn't too bad because we can attract a lot of different types of talent. In client industries that found it more difficult to attract AI people, having this kind of competition where somebody internal could partner with an external person also led to great ideas. So this is different to what Laurie, I think, and Claudia were describing. This is bottom-up bubbling. I used to analyze the inputs. So we'd have 160 applicants for funding, so I liked to analyze these things. And it was interesting to see, at least in the McKinsey case, the truly radical ideas came from people who were fewer than 2 years at McKinsey. After about 2 years, they were good ideas, but they were solving problems that were right in front of you, which meant, of course, they worked, but they weren't quite as disruptive as the stuff that came out of the young men and women who had more or less, just joined. So anyway, it's a great way of building awareness, not just at the top, but throughout the organization, and unleashing quite a bit of enthusiasm. But just watch out, like the academic environment, the originators of the ideas may not want to be the entrepreneurs. So you may have to do some parallel recruiting.
Simon, let me just riff on a little on what Connor just said. I think one of the things that we all get challenged with is a lot of stuff that boards deal with is in the time horizon of 12 months. And I think most of the stuff in the technology area, which is disruptive, is not a 12-month thing. It's a 36, 48, 60-month thing. You know, I was very involved in the very early days of cloud computing. I'll tell you, by 2002, it was fairly obvious if you were a student of what was going on, that this was going to disrupt the entire software industry. In fact, I had the fun of writing a book called The End of Software, even when I was at Oracle. And it wasn't because you knew exactly what was going to happen. What you could tell is that the fundamental economics of delivering software as a service were entirely different than the old world we had come from. And that realization fueled, I would say at this point in time, 15 years of where we are right now. So I would counsel also not to look like right in front of you, because that's, you know, the SAP implementation or whatever. It's really, if you look out 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, what are these things that are gonna, you know, economically shift and therefore transform either your business or somebody else takes advantage of it. So it's a time horizon thing is my point, and I think Connor was making the same point as well.
So we have a few questions coming through, and one is from Sarah for our panel, and it's on board education. And then after that, we have a question from Rich on currency. So if you both want to go ahead and unmute, and Sarah, you can tee up your question.
All right, and I've already gotten some great ideas. So it tells you something. I'm on an ag mortgage board, and I'm probably the most tech savvy person on the board, and that's because I sit on a small tech company and was VP of bioinformatics 20 years ago, which was a totally different. So on a board like mine, which is mostly older ag mortgage bankers, which is not the most technologically advanced group of people, we have our technology oversight sits with the strategy and business development committee, which I oversee. So we see it as a part of strategy. I'm looking for great ideas of how to get the board appropriately educated so we can make the right decisions and keep them off of the, we need a technology committee, because we don't need another committee on our board. So hit me.
Sarah, I have one idea for you, but I'm afraid you're going to have to sort of take it and reorganize it a little bit. But when I've talked to directors about what's the best education experience they have, either in an industry or in the technology that underpins an industry, it's often been a private equity due diligence process. So, you know, and I've done it myself, you know, you've got a private equity firm that's intending to buy, let's say, an ag mortgage company, and it's going through a process of commercial due diligence, and if it gets into the bidding phase, technical due diligence, financial accounting due diligence, legal due diligence. Well, that due diligence, and they involve the men and women whom they would like to have on the board afterwards. And that boot camp over 3 months, they tell me, at least board directors tell me, it's the best education they've ever had, because they go into the company, obviously, they go in with a perspective that has been expensively produced. I mean, the private equity firm might spend $500,000 to $1 million on this due diligence. So it may not be entirely appropriate for what you're up to, but you're getting these outside experts in to come to a view. And the closest thing I could imagine for your situation would be if you convinced your colleagues that you needed someone to do an outside-in view, as if you were going to be taken over, you know, like an activist was going to, something like that, where they were not forced, but required to participate at pace, might be a parallel. I'm struggling a bit to make the parallel, but the actual due diligence thing works very well for them. They tell me afterwards, they come onto the boards, and instead of being 2 years to learn the ropes, they're in after 6 months because they've been so well trained.
Interesting.
So, Sarah, it's an old idea, but probably a good idea. It's very similar to what Connor was saying. So a long time ago, I met Jeffrey Moore before Jeffrey Moore was Jeffrey Moore, because he was working at Regis McKenna. And they had started this idea, which I think is really kind of, we don't use it very much anymore. It was called a crush operation. So the idea was, you take a group of people, and it could be your board members, it could be some of the employees, you put them together and you go, okay, guys, if you had all the resource in the world, whatever, how would you crush our company? And it gets you starting to see and think about how disruption, how new technology, how a different go-to-market strategy, et cetera, may be successful in killing off your business. And I think it's a good team building exercise, but it's also, I think, a good way to synthesize everything together, not as some one single, either little bitty points, but as one total idea. And you may try that.
And both of these, both Connor and Timothy, you guys brought up a great way to move a board from low engagement to high engagement as well. Once they really understand some of the external trends and some of the keys for success, they tend to even be more engaged going forward.
I just, on Tim's thing, it's a great idea, and it's a variant, I think, or mine is a variant on his. His was the original, but the activist teardown, as they call it, get somebody friendly to behave as if he or she was an activist, is another way of getting this crush psychology that you've just described, Tim.
And I one thing I would again reiterate though is it's having the board educated is one thing, having the executive team educated is another. And I actually got this idea from Claudia. My executive team from one of my companies happened to be in the Bay Area doing due diligence on a company we were looking to acquire that was not technology related. But while they were in town, I said, hey, why don't you stop by my venture capital firm? Do you have a day to kill? And we'll talk about what's happening in the world of AI and Internet of Things and robotics and 3D printing and software-defined networking and e-commerce. And I'll bring in a whole bunch of our portfolio companies and I'll bring in my colleagues and we can have a robust discussion. So we spent a day exposing them to stuff that they would never typically have been exposed to just to get the juices flowing. And it was funny because afterwards they kind of looked at me saying, but we don't do any of this in our business. And so afterwards I had a call with the CEO saying, how are we going to make sure that your executive team is aware of all these things going forward? Because it's going to be hard to have the discussion at the board if your exec team isn't aware. And he's since been evolving, and we brought in a new head of sales who is much more tech savvy and is starting an internal newsletter on all the technology innovations that are happening in that industry. And so it's starting, but you have to start somewhere. But I think exposing them, I won't say that Silicon Valley is where all the answers are. We just happen to have a bunch of companies who could talk about it. It can be anywhere, but I think it's really important to ensure that you have an executive team that's thinking about it as much as it is the board.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rich, do you want to pop in here?
Yeah, actually, I do have a couple of things. And actually, one of the things I wanted to do was to piggyback on what Claudia and Lauria were saying. For those who are not in the VC world or investment world, there are a lot of places that you can get exposure to the startup community. There's a lot of local university, maybe your alum association, or Clean Tech Open. There's a whole bunch of places looking for mentors. So it's actually a great chance for you to not only learn, but to give back for those who have free time. Like I know Nora's always looking for something to do, but for anyways, I wanted to just throw out, and first I'll say is, part of my background is I spent 6 years in the 5-sided wind tunnel chasing technology. So looking out 2 to 10 years ahead, and we had a couple of things that, the technology was not the end game. It was an enabler / force multiplier used to better do operations. And so some of the things that you had to look at was, are we going to do an evolutionary or revolutionary change? Do we leapfrog? All which, are things probably that a business needs to be thinking about, because there is a cost to implement technology, but you need to do it in order to stay ahead of the game. So there's this balance. But what I was going to throw out is 2 things. One is I found some of the best inputs that I got were from people who were not technologists. They were people who just weren't constrained by technology, thinking out of the box. Well, why don't we do this? And you go, well, that's not the way it's done. And then when you start to think about it, there is a way to achieve that end goal. So really, I think from board members, it's about strategy and looking for things that we can do with our company. And sometimes what I worry about with technologists, and I've had this in a time with intelligence agency and in the Pentagon, of the so-called expert becomes dated and becomes stale. And so really the question is, how do you keep current? And then how do we get board members, what are some of the things they can do? Because I really think we talk about educating board members, but I think as a board member, the onus is on you to understand and seek technology and understand your industry. If you haven't figured out your industry and you accept the board position, shame on you for not learning it. No one should hand it to you on a silver platter. Anyways, kind of teed up for comment for you guys.
Let me just comment on it, Rick. It's about what to get educated on, maybe an interesting thing to talk about. I was invited a few years ago to talk to Jeff Emmelt's direct reports at General Electric, and it was a dinner time conversation. And so I decided to name my talk, "Why is Hardware Not Software?" So I started out, I said, well, okay, guys, I have no idea how you build jet engines or MRI scanners, right, or oil and gas equipment. I said, but I will tell you one thing, building hardware is not like building software. And so I went through like 3 examples of why these were very different, because I worry sometimes that, you know, whether it's senior leadership, to Lori's comment, or boards, that we're not well enough educated on some very fundamental ideas of how to think about this stuff. I don't know precisely how you all get educated on that, but I think if your fundamental premises are wrong, and by the way, building hardware, building software is a good example. You know, I'll just trivial example. I told them, I said, guys, look, I think when you go build a jet engine, you think about having a 100-person team, a 1,000-person team, and you're going to have a large team to go build a jet engine. I said, but in the world of software, we know that's a bad answer. Don't get a 1,000-person team, get a 10-person team. But it's counterintuitive to their way of thinking. And I think from a management perspective, if your intuitions are not informed, you're going to go down the wrong path fast. My 2 cents.
Actually, Tim, if I might say, in a way, you know, you've addressed a concern I had about something you were saying earlier, and I may now be doing an injustice to remuneration technology, but, you know, I went back just for the hell of it and did Stanford's machine learning course to see, you know, how much I remembered from when I was a software engineer. And it was striking to me that it was very useful, that I still remembered linear algebra and partial differential equations, because the whole thing was built on that. But it also made me think, if I had a humanities background, it would have taken me a while, because I would have had to find somebody to explain that to me in plain English. So I think there is an edifice of knowledge on which you build, and it can be a little bit harder if you don't know those bricks in the edifice that you've just described. And somehow or other, and perhaps it's a vanity, I think I could probably more quickly build the edifice required to understand remuneration than I could if I didn't have it to understand software engineering. Does that make sense to you, or do you think I'm just being arrogant here, that in fact remuneration is quite a complex business and I shouldn't say this about it?
Well, I'm sympathetic to your point of view. But I do believe, I keep going back to, I think if one was to sit down with, you know, people in software, there are some fundamental notions that we understand that we don't know how to quite share with people who are not, quote, steeped in this or born in this. And I challenge, maybe that's a statement to make, I challenge everybody on this call to start to think about how you do that, you know, inside your board with your executive, et cetera, because I worry that it isn't, if we are not based on some fundamental ideas and premises, then this just gets all over the map. So.
Well, and the good news is the one in Brockton is the one that's running the ACD, right?
I can't hear that voice, Danielle. Can you?
Yeah.
I think there might be some background noise, so everyone should be muted if you're not a speaker. So I think this is a good reminder for everyone to mute if they have any background noise coming through, but we do have a question from Becky Taylor, and it's on the decision criteria for deciding how to integrate a technology presence on the board. So Becky, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Daniela. Appreciate it. I am really getting a lot out of this conversation. I'm a recovered computer scientist, and Tim, I was reminded by your comment about Stanford's computer science program, how young our industry is. You know, my computer science degree comes from Iowa State, which happens to have been among the older 50 years anniversary last year, but it's a young industry, and therefore we don't have the kind of history and interaction and involvement as an industry. So we do run into these kinds of dilemmas on how to integrate that skill set and when to do so. The question that I had therefore relates to, I serve on the board of Fountech Ventures, which is an investment company, and we have begun to build a portfolio of very advanced, very early AI and related technologies in a variety of industries and markets. And so my role as a board member is more of mentoring the founders who have never done this before. And the skill sets that we are looking for are driven largely by the fact that we have a computer scientist in me on the board, and we also have an AI expert who's been doing this stuff for 30 years also on the board. So we're helping to lead and build an organization that is affected by the technology, because the products that we're building are companies that are based on technology. And so that's one kind of board member that we need. I'm curious whether the panelists have any criteria that they have used when they're trying to figure out how to integrate technology skill sets onto boards that are affected by technology. So security issues, HR related issues, privacy issues, ethics is something that I'm deeply interested in. How do you guys help boards that you're on decide whether and when and how to integrate a technologist into the board? Because I'm hearing two very different scenarios, one from Lori about the advisory council that's feels like more of a technology product company scenario, as opposed to a completely unrelated, financial services company that is affected by the technology in their day-to-day operations and long-term strategy.
Becky, I don't have a complete answer for you, but I have something that I'm seeing emerging, which might be helpful to you. And there was one chairman of it was an investment company actually, his answer to your question would be that in many industries, the chief ethics officer or the chief risk officer needs to be somebody on the board who's running, who's thinking about especially AI and privacy issues. Both because they can hugely endanger a company's reputation, or they can inhibit development. So in some of the industries I spoke about earlier, the pharmaceuticals, aerospace, the people lower down in the organization are actually self-censoring because they know that the regulator hasn't caught up with them, and they're worried if they do this, it'll get squashed in 2 years' time when the regulator does catch up with them. And so you need, this man's thought was you need to elevate this to the highest possible level. So maybe in industries that are affected by technology rather than being technology industries, maybe one way in at least is this management of reputation, because so much of it, reputation and also strategic advancement in the use of technology, because so much of it funnels its way up into risk these days. Not a complete answer, but just one idea that might be helpful to you.
I was going to say that I think in financial services, I think cyber, info security, privacy are all absolutely critical. And so I think either you have a technology committee, which is common, or the whole board needs to get educated. And I'll put in a plug for the fabulous NACD cybersecurity oversight course that I took. And I've actually worked in building security products, but even I learned a ton because it was, how do you have oversight over security within a company? And I found it to be incredibly instructive. Only a small percentage of it actually was the technology. Most of it was, what are the questions you should ask as a board member? What should you look for? And based on that course, I went back to one of my boards where it is a technology company, and the CISO got up to say everything was peachy keen. And I said, you are completely wrong. I actually said, we are not peachy keen. Here are the 50 things that we're actually not doing. And it's completely changed how the entire board now is looking at cybersecurity within the company. So there's an example of some phenomenal training, and it does take a long time. Let me tell you, it is a 40-hour training course. Claudia made me do it, and I was not happy giving up all those weekends, but it turned out to be really phenomenal. So in financial services, I mean, my goodness, you know, cyber is everything. And so I would say your whole board probably needs to go through that cyber training, which also kind of opens up technology. The second thing I would say is I think we have to be careful not to narrowly define technology as software and hardware. I'm spending a lot of time learning about mycelium-based technology, which is huge right now in food tech and in synthetic leather. And so I'm diving into food tech right now and having really interesting conversations with boards of large food processing, consumer foods companies. Let's not forget biotech. I'm spending time trying to learn about oncology therapeutics. So I think it's not software and hardware. Technology is the evolution and the progress and the improvement and the disruption in an industry. And I think we have to be careful not to think it's computer science and AI. Technology is very broad, and what is important new technology that's going to disrupt the industry is going to vary, again, back to my previous point, dramatically based on the industry, because boy, for McDonald's, what's going to disrupt them may not be hardware. It may be some weird food ingredient that comes out later. So I think it's really important to understand technology in its broadest sense and what are the technology disruptions specific to that industry. But I think in financial services, cyber has got, and info security and privacy has got to be key.
So that raises a very interesting, you've done a great job articulating the question that I really want to ask, and that is, Nora said earlier that the real estate, which is the time on the agenda, is extremely precious, and therefore how do you structure your board to flow into the conversations that you have time to have that are the most important for the long-term health of the company. So what you've just talked about, Lori, is, you know, the biotech space that you're having to learn about. You know, if we followed this conversation to its logical conclusion, we'd wind up with very large boards with a biotech person and a software person and a hardware person on the board. So I'm really curious how, you know, how the folks on this call have found criteria that help guide the decision on when it makes sense to use one of those precious board seats for a particular background.
I mean, I'll have a go at that if it's helpful. I mean, again, this comes from the private equity world, and there are good data that shows if you've got an expert on the board who has experience in the industry's future, let's put it that way, because he's or she's come from an industry that's already lived that, you can see it coming through in alpha. You can see it coming through in shareholder value creation. But now these boards are only operating on 5-year cycles. You know, that's the ownership period of private equity. So maybe part of the answer to your question is think about the next 5-year cycle and think about somebody who probably doesn't know your industry because his or her experience will come from a more advanced industry, whom you're going to train up and who's going to contribute that experience from the more advanced industry to your board, but not over a 10-year board tenure, maybe over a 5-year board tenure. That might be one way of considering it. And the only other point I would make on this is that most of the research I've seen about boards' visible attributes and their performance, the company's financial performance, never come to anything except perhaps for one which is small boards do better. So oddly enough, if you can pull off what you're describing by having fewer people spend more time rather than enlarging the board, you'll do even better.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Can I just make a comment about, I worry a little bit that this is the technologies on the board question, which is, you know, executives are not supposed to be subject matter experts. Executives are the people who sit there and look, synthesize, understand, and then bring to bear, by virtue of the right questions, the right resources. And I think you know, it's impossible. I mean, I was just, for those of you who haven't seen it, I mean, there's a very cool Nova on this whole gene editing thing that is starting to happen. I'm just staring at this stuff. This is freaking amazing, right? And, but how could any of us, you know, become subject matter experts on and such a wide range of things unless you had a board of 50 people? And I think we need to find a way to, you know, be technology executives rather than subject matter experts is kind of where I would push the conversation.
I just want to add two things here. So again, Connor, totally agree with the statement. Smaller boards are with spending more time are better than large boards. What can often happen is you just keep adding board members with little spikes, as opposed to really looking at the board effectiveness. So doing regular board effectiveness reviews, and even sometimes you've seen more companies putting in term limits, which create a mechanism to upgrade the board given the change in circumstances. So those are two things that good governance really helps to improve it.
So Todd, I think that's an excellent observation, but you know, here's the more systematic way of accomplishing what you just laid out. So, I mean, if you already have a board, you have, but as you're thinking of refreshing the board or adding new members to the board, you have to think of the skill sets that you would like to ideally see in the board. Maybe different kinds of technology, some expertise in finance and investments, some expertise in ESG maybe nowadays, expertise in compensation and incentives. And so these are the skill sets you'd like to have. Then you try to build a matrix and see as to currently which board members provide what types of skills, and ideally a board member should provide at least 2 types of skills. And then you'll see some gaps in that matrix. And that's going to give you some ideas as to, you know, what the next board member's skill set should look like.
No, and that's often what we're doing at the beginning of a board search, right? Really getting that capabilities matrix to really have the the existing board members aligned as to the understanding of what they want to add to the board, and then also a clear understanding of what to go look for as well.
Can I just add a quick comment? Tim talked earlier about intuition, and we're talking about breadth of expertise here. And I think one of the things that may need to change in boards, and this is a bit broad, forgive me, but is that we often hope that people in their 50s and 60s have seen it all before and therefore will have a very quick intuitive response. And everything that Danny Kahneman and the other psychologists tell us is that unless you've done that thing again and again and again, and the environment in which it's happening doesn't change, intuition is very dangerous. So read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And we're in a constantly changing context, and Tim has just pointed out the breadth of topics we need to cover is ever broader. So maybe shifting the expectation of board members that they have an instant intuitive answer, and requiring them or expecting them to go through the steps of getting the data, thinking about the data, and then coming to their conclusion might well be a change in style in some boards that's necessary to cope with the phenomenon that Becky's describing, you know, the breadth, and indeed Laurie was talking about, the breadth of topics that people have to cover.
Timothy, I think we're going to need to wrap up. Do you have any closing remarks here? It's gone so fast. I just can't even believe it. And I really appreciate it. We put a survey over in the chat box we'd like people to fill out, and really appreciate everybody coming. I just wondered if you had any last minute ways to close out our session here.
Yeah, I'll just say, hey, thanks, Connor, Lori, Todd, for the time, and all of you for joining us. I challenge you all to go back to your boards and ask the question, is technology governance important? And if so, how do we want to go do this? Do we need to recruit new board members? And I think you have Todd's email. or, you know, do you need to get better educated? Do we need to form technology committees? I just would encourage you to take what you've learned here and activate it. I started out with, I'm not sure any of us know the answer to this question. And I think as Becky said, we're a young industry. As we start to figure this thing out, maybe all of you are part of figuring that out. So I appreciate all of your time.
I want to thank you too for starting early in the morning. I know that was because of me. And I found it intriguing. In fact, the only person who really sort of zoned out very early on was Tim's cat. I think everybody else was.
This has been a wonderful discussion. I so appreciate our esteemed panel, and thank you so much for being a part of the discussion. We will send out everybody's contact information after the program, so you'll have it. And if I could ask our panelists to stay on for just a couple of minutes afterwards, that would be helpful. Thanks, and everybody have a great day. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
It was terrific.
Connor, what's the weather like?
Down here in Southern, it's...
Nora, are you going to stay on? Good.
Yeah, I thought, is that all right?
Oh, thank you. I would welcome it. I would really welcome it. Thank you so much.
What's the weather like, Connor? Is it warm?
The weather is lovely in Southern Italy. It's, you know, it's 27 degrees. I have to translate that. It's hot. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's not super hot, but it's beautiful. You'd lie out there and swim in the sea, which is what I intend to do tomorrow morning. So I suppose for Californians, that's nothing extraordinary because it's probably beautiful in Southern
California. In the north. We don't
north.
Swim in the ocean in the north.
No.
And we don't know when our passports will work in Italy again. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all. I think really we could have just kept talking. What do you think, Nora? Nora, you're the one.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like 10 minutes. I was kind of shocked when people said they had to leave. I thought it was excellent, and the diversity of the speakers was great. And then the lead off with a model of how to think about it, like what's your engagement, how big, you know, this was awesome. I think we need to do another one. Several people said,
yeah,
can we have it again? I think some people want to come to the same one. The same people want to come to the same one again. How did you guys feel as the speakers? I thought it was just awesome.
Well, I mean, I particularly love Tim opening it up to the floor because I always find when people exchange what they've lived, first of all, I learn a lot from it. I learn a lot more listening than I do talking. And I think it's also very powerful because, you know, they've lived experiences. And when you've got 10 of them going, you're getting to something special, I think. I mean, Laurie, obviously you did that as a panelist, as a speaker, but others were doing it, chipping in their own. It was great. And it was great to encourage that, Tim. I thought it was great.
Yeah, thanks.
I was encouraged with the questions that came through in the chat room, and Danielle, you did a great job of organizing that and bringing them through. But it was a diverse set of questions. I think they were very relevant questions, and it was also great that the participants helped answer them. It wasn't just up to us.
Yeah.
That added a lot to. I loved, you know, hey, what do I do? I'm just a mortgage banking, and I that tech is really important to you. And then I'm a chemist. I'm a chemical company. I think it was great to see. Yeah. They were already thinking, oh gosh, what am I supposed to do in my industry? You know, so I think it was that added
mission accomplished in that way. I feel like everybody started thinking differently. I could just see the wheels turning. I was encouraged and enthusiastic about it.
I thought also, Todd, the reality of recruiting a board member with all of these wonderful attributes. You and there was a gentleman, I'd say originally from India. What was his name? Sanjay, I think.
Sanjay.
Sanjay. The two of you, I thought, did that extremely well. You know, and that's important because people can get completely unrealistic some of the time about what they're going to find out there.
Thank you.
Well, I really, there was, I just wanted you to know how appreciative we are. And Tim, honestly, this my hat's off to you. Wouldn't have happened without you coming with a good idea. And sometimes the best programs are people with innovative ideas about a program. So I'm very grateful. And again, is there anything else that you wanted us to send out? You know, we're going to send it. Tim wrote an article about this subject, and so we're going to send it out after the program. So that'll be good.
He did too. He sent me a link to it. Did he send it to you as well?
I'm sure he may have. I just haven't gotten to my email yet, so we'll take a look, see.
Okay.
And there was something suggested in the, oh, sorry, Lori.
Oh, no, go ahead.
There was something suggested in the chat too. It looked like, I didn't write it down, but it looked like a really good resource as well. I'm sure one of you saw it.
The World Economic Forum.
Yeah, something. Yeah, some paper.
Okay, we'll grab that.
On AI, and then Sanjay recommended, let me put it in the chat window for you because he sent it to me privately, and I haven't, of course, read it yet. But Lisa, I'm sending it to you. Oh, actually, yeah.
Thank you.
If I do everyone now, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
everyone's fine. Good. Thank you.
And Lisa, just Connor's written some interesting stuff that I don't know if you guys have and can reference.
I'm happy to send it on. I mean, it's more about, you know, boards and engagement than it is specifically about technology. Although, no, I sent you one about AI and its adoption. Yeah, it's probably worth sending you that as well. AI adoption is probably the closest. Is that what you had in mind, Tim?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yes.
Okay, send that on.
Yeah.
Great.